Okay, so it looks like most of us are here now. I'm delighted to pass over to our Mailer Campbell faculty member, Helen Dougard, who's going to introduce Anne. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Alana, and good morning, everybody who is with us. So what a privilege to be introducing Anne Scoular today, but what can I say? There's a lot that we already know about our beloved Anne as co-founder of Mailer Campbell, but what do you not know is what I'm intrigued to know. If you do a Google search on Anne, you will find 116,000 results. 116,000 results. And the lead one is obviously about her as co-founder of our beloved Mailer Campbell. But what else is there to know? Well, Anne is also an intermittent and happy gardener when she has an opportunity. But what brings us together today is her absolute love and her joy and her innate passion, which is incredibly seductive, for family history as a true historian. So what better way is there today in lockdown to spend time, this precious time with Anne, as she helps us unlock the key to researching our personal family histories. And I got lost in Google searching for Anne as I came across quotes on family history. And I just wanted to share one or two with you that particularly struck me in preparation for today. The first is by Maya Angelou, who says, "The more you know of your history, the more liberated you are." And the second by Helen Keller, "There is no king who has not had a slave among his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king among his." So, before we start, so we know how to research whether we have slaves or kings in our past, we would just be really curious to understand what knowledge you currently have or experience of researching family history. So Alana is going to share a poll live on screen right now. And there are 5 choices that we would just like you to take a moment to read and just indicate your level of experience in terms of researching your family history to date. Are you an absolute beginner through to an expert who's very experienced? So just take a moment. I can see that you're already doing that to register. And once done, Alana will share the results. And I will hand over to the wonderful Anne Scoular.
Great. So thank you very much, Helen. You're always inspiring, but those are particularly lovely quotes.
Thank you.
And a warm welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to see that most of you have put absolute beginner, because that's how I've pitched the day. Somebody's begun the pre-work. Camilla, I picked up your message, but the pre-work will appear for you. Some of you have dabbled, some have some experience, and one slightly alarming person is very experienced. So we'll get to know more of you, your interests in the Q&A afterwards. But let's start. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes. It is recorded, but only the me talking piece. So if you want to share the most appalling scandal about your ancestors, then you're welcome to do it in the Q&A afterwards, and it won't be recorded. So family history. This has so many benefits for me. This welcome to my other life. And this part of my life keeps me sane. I get into flow when I'm researching, and how vital that is now to have a place to go where I can be calm and centered. It also gives me perspective, really important coaching senior leaders. This gives me the long run view of history and a deep knowledge that this will pass. And also it gives me fun. So let's start sharing some of that with you. Alana, we've got the first slide, great. So the most crucial first step, some of you have already done. And those of you who haven't, it's all there waiting for you. So the first and vital step is gathering together what you already know. And I hope some of you have been surprised by how much you can find out. And there are many members of our community who come from groups, geographies, categories of people where there have been less records than usual, or because of oppression or change or war, records have been destroyed. But everybody can experience this first bit. So get the data together, start asking other family members what they can remember. The stories can give you valuable clues for later, and the documents will give you a springboard to get to the 1911 census, which is one of my targets for you. And it might seem really strange that I'm saying right at the beginning, where 68% of you said you're absolute beginners, I'm saying right at the beginning, publish, think about publishing. But family historians typically say, oh, I'll publish this when I'm finished. Well, we're never finished. So share it as you go along. It might be a blog, it might be sharing some photographs among other members of the family, distributing it out there so that it's safe if it's in multiple sources. Alana, next slide. So what do you need to get started? Answer, absolutely nothing. Nothing is essential. This is a delightfully inexpensive hobby. If you want to splash out, you could buy a pencil. Pencils are what you need in archives. I'll talk about that later. And if you want to spend a little bit more, about £39, I would recommend a software package. Now, this is a basket to store the information in. This isn't all the information itself, that comes next, but a software package where you can, it's a database, but a specially designed one for family history, where you put in everything you find. You can put photographs, you can put videos, and facts and documents and everything. And it saves you losing anything, and it helps you organize it. And of course, it will print it all out for you, make sense of it for you in wonderful family trees or reports or anything you like. I use Family Historian 6. The people at TWR Computing are absolutely lovely. They are obsessive family historians themselves and very generous about helping beginners get started. So you've got a basket. What are you going to put in it? Well, you've probably heard about Ancestry or Find My Past. Those are the two big packages that you pay for, and I'm going to be talking about them as we go through. And they open up a world of data for you. But don't forget, in the handout, which we sent out in advance, the pre-work, there's a list of a full page of free websites where you can just type in any name you come across and see what comes up. You'll be astonished what comes up. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a mountain of information out there. Alana, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, what is the basic process? The principles, I'm going to be talking about mostly English family history, but I know many people on this call, that's not where your ancestors may have come from. But the principles are the same everywhere. So the first principle is build on solid ground. Really build solidly from what you know and can evidence and prove and be really confident about. Otherwise, in 10 years, you might have this fabulous family tree with all these interesting ancestors, and suddenly you discover, oops, they're not mine because I made a mistake really early on. Funnily enough, getting it right at the beginning is pretty important. So the basic process is you start with a reliable document, typically a birth certificate, and on the birth certificate, it should say the full names of the parents. Because you've got the parents' full names, from that you can go back and find their marriage certificate. Their marriage certificate names their fathers, should give their full names. And with those two lots of full names plus a location, you can probably find the birth or baptism of those people, and that names their parents. You then find the parents' marriage certificate, which enables you to go back, etc. I use the word baptism. That's very important in English family history because you run out of state records fairly quickly, and the church records are important. But that applies in every jurisdiction and in every religion. Modern societies all take great care to notice the arrival of new citizens, and they record it somehow because, of course, they want to tax them. Alana, next slide. So here's an example of a certificate. This is a marriage certificate, it's green. Death certificates are black, birth certificates are pink, but otherwise they're very similar. And you can find a lot out from one. So this is in 1904, and Charles and Edith are getting married. And as I promised, if you look along, you can see the name of Charles' father, who's also called Charles Freestone, and Edith's father is called Peter. And then in the next box, you can see, annoyingly, that the registrar has just recorded both of the fathers as deceased. What you normally want there is their occupation, because then as you go and search for the birth information of Charles and Edith, and you know the parents' names, if you know an occupation, particularly if it's unusual, that helps you be really confident that you've got the right Charles Freestone. Bottom left corner, you can see they've both signed. They could both write. You would hope so in 1904, but don't be too shocked if you get certificates or if you see parish register entries and they can't write, they just initial their name. Only widespread primary education in England from 1870. Before that, illiteracy was quite high. Alana, next slide. So, you've got the basic process of you're already very obediently going from birth certificate to marriage certificate to birth certificate, etc. But then we get to a wonderful launch pad, and actually it's where I really start if I'm helping a member of the community, and I have done a lot over the years. Then what I'm aiming to get to is the 1911 census in England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, Northern Ireland, all of Ireland actually in 1911. So the 1911 census is very special. It's the most recent one we have because here's another principle. Don't put anything online that's younger than 100 years old because we want to protect people from identity theft, identity fraud. So 1911 is the latest one we've got. It's also a really special one because like all censuses, it gives you a snapshot of the family at home on census night. And there they are, and it locks the family together because it shows you husband, wife, children, etc. So it's the one place where you have proof that these are indeed the children of these parents. And the 1911 census also has some special information about the number of children and who've been born and died. And then you can go back all the way from 1911 to 1841 in England. There has been a census every 10 years since 1841. In the States, they started a bit earlier. Next slide, please, Lana. So here is the 1911 census. This is for James Little. And if he's your great-grandfather, say, you can find a lot out about him. First of all, you know that he's a bit impulsive because he hasn't read the small print. You see where it's got 422 and crossed out. That's the number of years since they were married, the number of children born, and the number of children still alive. And it says in the small print that you put this in the row for the wife, not for the husband. So he just started filling it in. Then he thought, oops, crossed it out and wrote it in there. So you know a little bit about James already. His occupation is a journalist, and his birth on the right-hand side was in Forfarshire. And bottom right, that's his signature. Doesn't look like a signature, it looks like he's just sort of writing his name and his address. In the middle, you can see that their house has 7 rooms. That's pretty generous at this time. And the delightful thing about this particular one is you can also realize that James has a sense of humor, which we definitely want to know about our ancestors, because he's written, in addition, we have an Airedale Terrier, and he's listed him, Roger. He's 5 years old, and he was born in Keighley, Yorkshire, which to me says that James has a dry sense of humour, because of course Keighley is in Airedale, where the terrier is from. Next slide, please, Alana. You don't find such amusing little bits on most census entries, I should say, although keep an eye out in the 1911 census. If you have an ancestor who was a suffragette, they defaced their census forms in very creative and rude ways. However, we're now respectable. This is 1901, and this is just to show you the format that all the other censuses have going back to 1841. So list of the people, their names, their relationship to head of household, ages, occupation, and where they were born. Jolly useful. The little narrow column to the immediate left of the names, that is number of rooms in the house if less than 5. So in the top household, Joseph Rudkin and his wife and 6 children are living in 4 rooms. He's a coal miner. And the next household, John Hinckley, who's a plumber and gas fitter, has got a smaller household, but the spaciousness of at least 5 rooms. The diagonal marks to the left of that small column show households and sub-households. If there are 2 diagonal lines, that means it's an entirely new household, a new building. If there's only 1 diagonal line, then it's a different household, a sub-household within the same building. Alana, next slide. So we've got the concept of birth, death, and marriage information, which you can get, and then the sense that you can lock that together with more comfort working from the census. So now we've moved on to the next big of the big 3 of family history, and these are wills. And one of the reasons why family history is easier in England, one is the reason that it's got more records than any other place on the planet other than Iceland. But the other reason is that we've had centralized administration for 1,000 years. And so this applies to wills since 1858. So there's a national probate register. So if somebody left a will and their family registered it at the court, got probate for it, which not all families did, but if they did, then there's a register. So you can just key in your ancestor's name, and if they left a will, up it will pop. Now, this is better than an index. This is on Ancestry. Birth, death, and marriage information and census information is on all of the big sites. It's on both Ancestry and Find My Past. But this National Probate Register is only on Ancestry. And if you strike lucky and your ancestor had a will approved, up will pop not just a reference so you can order the will, although you get that, but a nice little paragraph that tells you what date they died, the address they died at, who their executors were and the relationship. So it might say, you know, Minnie Jones' daughter, and how much they left, if you're nosy. Very sadly, sometimes it's things like £11, 3 shillings and 2pence. And you can then go on to order the will by post. Before 1858, it's decentralized, and there are some wills still available through TNA, the National Archives at Kew, which you'll hear me talk about a lot more. They're £3.50 each if you buy them online, but they're free if you go to Kew, and you can take a memory stick and hoover up everything that they've got for free. But otherwise, apart from those ones at the National Archives, which were the wills of, on the whole, the wealthiest people, or those who died at sea, most of them are in county record offices. And how do you know where it was? Tricky. There's there's a lot of information available, including in the book by Herber, which I'll also mention again. But increasingly wills are being put online. All of the Welsh wills are free online on the Welsh National Library site, and Dorset's wills from 1865, yes, 1865, you can read online at Ancestry. Alana, next slide. So here's a will, here's an example. This is from a member of my family, I think, although I haven't precisely proved it. John Maskew, who died in Cartmel Fell in 1592. And you, first of all, in those years, you learn a lot about his religious faith, because those first few lines are committing his soul to Almighty God, who is my Redeemer, and etc., etc. And then he gets to bequeathing his possessions. He has 4 daughters, and he leaves his eldest, Janet, his jacket. And the others get a scarf and something, and his youngest gets his pair of boots. So you can sort of feel what it was like for John Maskew farming on very poor land up on the fells. And so this shows you it's not only the rich who left wills by any means. And here, isn't this wonderful? I can read my family member's will from 1592 and understand a bit about his family. Alana, next slide, please. So you're getting the idea, the basic cycle. You start solidly with the information, the evidence you've got, work back, get a marriage certificate from which you get the mother's maiden name, i.e. you've then got both of their full names at birth. Then you can therefore find the parents' marriages and births and repeat. Now, let me add a little piece in there. I've used the word certificates because that's what you have to have until about the 1920s. Because of the 100-year rule, parish records are not available online until 100 years has expired. So once you get to the 1920s, though, you stop having to spend any money on certificates, which are expensive. And as a matter of principle, I haven't spent any money on getting a birth, death, or marriage certificate for years. And I regard it as a matter of pride that when I'm helping other people, they don't have to either. Because you can get the information directly from the parish records. Because if you get a certificate, remember that bit that was along the middle of the certificate, that's just a transcription, therefore possible errors, of the parish register anyway, which was the recording device. And so you might as well go back to the source, and it's all free once you've paid your subscription to Ancestry or Find My Past. So your cycle has now changed a bit. It's now certificate or parish register entry, which gives you the mother's maiden name, and you can find their marriages and their births and go back, and then you wrap it all around, hold it together, confirm your hypotheses, or annoyingly discover you were wrong with the census and with wills. And then the other thing you can do, of course, and probably will do, is go off on a million little side journeys. So you might discover that your ancestor has an interesting occupation. One of my friends, Amelia Campbell, discovered her great-grandfather was a gold beater. She and I didn't have any idea what a gold beater is, but so she went off to Goldsmiths company and found out fascinating things about his life and where he worked. And then, just to repeat, record what you capture. Put it in your family history software and reference it very, very scrupulously, because, as I say, in a few years' time, you'll find, or in a few months' time, you'll find something that doesn't work. You know, you've got a mother being born after her alleged child, for example, and you need to be able to unpick how you got there. Alana, next slide. So far, I've been implying that you can have this nice, neat progression, back, 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 back. But of course, it doesn't happen. We all hit brick walls. And so what you have to do is hop from one record to another, move sideways. If you get stuck here, you know, you can't find a marriage certificate, you can't find anything in the parish registers. Did they actually get married? Or you can't find somebody's birth or baptism. there's always a way of ducking around sideways. You probably, if you've got English ancestors, you've got a really fighting chance, given the combination of parish registers, civic certificates of birth, death and marriage, wills and the census. You've got a really strong chance of getting back to the 1830s, 1840s. And sometimes I can do it within half an hour for somebody, which is quite fun. And so jumping around, don't forget the free sources in the list that I mentioned. I just start, any new name I come across, I just start by putting it into Google. Amazing what comes up. So I'm cantering through this process really quickly, but Herber, Mark Herber's wonderful book, which I talked about in the joining instructions, and here it is, Ancestral Trails, bit of a tome, but this is Herber, and I love Herber. And if you treat yourself to a copy, so will you, because Herber explains every step in beautifully written, really clear, warm, interesting, and thorough. So you're getting the point about referencing everything, and you'll be amazed how, as you explore back and back, things that seem completely unrelated suddenly explain a problem you had way back. Alana, next slide, please. Yeah. So just to summarize, what are the rules? Search backwards, not forwards. If you've got an unusual surname and there's an ancestor out there you'd love to be related to, and you just sort of think, oh yes, they were in the 1700s, I'll try and follow it forwards. Don't, it won't work. The records are not set up that way. Reference every fact. I've banged on about that enough. There are abbreviations to use. Birth, baptism, death. MI is another marvelous resource if you're lucky. Memorial inscription, that's the standard shorthand for that. And that is tombstones, which sometimes people wrote a lot on. And many of them have now gone, but genealogists have been obsessive for many hundreds of years. And in the 19th century, many of them thankfully crawled around old graveyards or blitzed graveyards that are about to be built over and captured all the data for us. Another rule, if you're going to be really, really pucker about this, or if you want to inherit the baronetcy or to prove that you're entitled to a vast fortune sitting somewhere, none of which has happened for all of the people I've helped in the community yet, but I live in hope, then you need not one, but 3 pieces of genealogical evidence per link. So to prove that Fred Smith is a son of John Smith, you might have a birth certificate naming them both, a marriage certificate naming them both, and perhaps a will where the father names the son and gives his occupation and his address so that it's really clear that these are indeed the same 2 people being linked together. If I had a wonderful outcome for today, it would be that some of you get really hooked, that would be brilliant, and end up going off to archives, because I have had many happy hours in archives. So archives are protecting very, very valuable documents. Most of the county archives in England have got records going back to the 900s, yes, and so they have rules. So all bags have to be stored in locked lockers. Very, very difficult for women who are used to having our handbag, clutched under our arm under all circumstances, but you're just only allowed to walk around with the key to the locker. This is where the famous pencil comes in. No pens or biros or anything allowed in the search rooms to protect the documents, and the pencils are not even allowed to have a rubber eraser on the end for the same reason. You're only allowed to take a few papers in, but you are allowed usually to take your phone or your iPad, and you can pay a fee, usually about £5 a day, and you can photograph every document you want, unless there's a very few that are very fragile and can't be subjected to too much light. which means that until you learn that it's not a good idea, you can come home with 100 photographs on your iPad and have no clue what they are. So I advise making notes as well. Another rule is don't believe what you see in front of you until you have proved it to your complete satisfaction. The rest is just data, possible data. Might be true, might be false. Yeah, keep your eyes wide open. A good rule for life, of course. Alana, next slide, please. So, I hope I've got you interested. So let's sort of dangle a little bit more bait in front of you. Past the basics, what else could you do? The system of civic registration of births, deaths and marriages goes back to 1837. Before that, the parish registers go to 1538. Yes. And only a few registers survive for 1538. For example, in York, one of my stamping grounds, there are 3 starting in 1538, but quite a lot starting in 1558, and almost all of them have started by the early 1600s. So you can take your family back if they stay put in one place and have a reasonably unusual name, or an unusual first name that they pass on from generation to generation. We like those people. Then you can whiz back through the parish registers. Fabulous. Lots of it's online. Annoyingly, half are on Ancestry and half are on Find My Past. So you just perhaps find out where your ancestors are clustered, and that might help you choose which one you sign up for. So there's all that wealth of parish information. There's a lot more parish information than just the registers too. Then there's another wealth of information about specialist ancestors. So for the clergy, there's a thing called Crockford's. There's another one called the Clergy List, and they are annual directories which have been published since 1841 and every year since I think about 1857. And they give a lot of information about your ancestor if they were a clergyman. The same for the army, and the army list starts formally starts in the 1700s, but I had a nice time in the York archives a year or two ago reading the muster rolls that showed my ancestors signing up and what weapon they had, a stick or a pike at most, in the 1500s. So there's a lot of information about the armed forces. Then there's the Society of Genealogists. They publish specialized publications. My ancestor was. And so one of them is My Ancestor Was Jewish. Now this is really valuable because I've talked to some Jewish friends who say, oh, I assume I can't do family history because all the records have been destroyed. Wrong. Of course, many have through years of warfare and oppression. But what has survived has been pulled together by enthusiasts, by obsessive genealogists. And so the Society of Genealogists book, My Ancestor Was Jewish, points you in the direction of that. Or My Ancestor Was a Congregationalist. That's one of the sub-splinter groups in the Protestant church. Or there's lots of booklets in their series about occupations. My ancestor was a coal miner or a traveller or worked on barges. And a very useful one is My Ancestor Was a Bastard. Because what do you do if you hit somebody who is firmly described in the parish register as illegitimate? Sometimes they use much ruder words, and no father is registered. Well, as always, there are ways to get around it. So useful little booklets. And of course, there are specialist societies. One of them is the Afro-American History and Genealogical Society, and they've partnered with Family Search, which is the biggest and oldest and free online database set up by the Mormon Church many, many years ago. And these two large organizations have got together and set up the Discover Freedmen website. So again, that the information that has survived for those who were slaves and then were liberated is pulled together. And so again, you can go onto that website and key in, and you might be lucky. And then there is the granddaddy of them all, the National Archives in Kew. I've used the word remarkable. Actually, there are no words for me that can describe the treasures of Kew and the fun of being there. And they also have very good fish and chips on Fridays, nice cafe, good salads, good coffee. So 5% of Kew's holdings, which is actually an astonishingly large amount, is online. But for the other 95%, you have to go there. I recommend it. Alana, next slide. So here's an example from one of these specialist publications I mentioned. This is for clergymen. This is Crockford's in 1932. And this is the entry for Harold Robinson. In order to pack it all in, they've used lots of abbreviations. But from this, we can see that Harold went to Christchurch, Oxford, lucky man, got a 3rd class. He then went off to Cuddesdon College, which is a theological college, and became ordained a priest in 1895. Now, then you can see all the places where he was posted. And if you're searching, you know, if your grandmother is one of his daughters, then you know where you're now going to look, you know, Cole Orton, Downside, Plumtree. And then, for the nosy of us, and actually if you're interested in family history, you're probably nosy. It's a wonderful skill in family history. You can see how much he earned. He earned £670 a year net in 1932, which was a lot of money, and a house was thrown in, probably a nice one. And for this, he was serving a population of 776 people, so it was fairly cushy life, Harold. And then there is his address, and then you can see his telephone number. I love it when some of these records show the telephone numbers of our ancestors. It gives me this wonderful illusion that I can ring them up. You know, hello, Harold, can I ask you a few questions? Alana, next slide. Please. So your software package will draw family trees for you. You just hit a button and out it will come. But actually, it's really useful if you know how to do it, just to jot down some notes or to capture something as you're in an archive or sitting at home looking at the screen and thinking, how do they all fit in? So really simple rules. Generations are on different lines. And then a marriage is shown with the full names of the people. So Fred Smith equals Mary Jones. So the equals sign means that Fred married Mary. And then any children of that marriage, a line comes down from the equals sign and then goes out to the side, and you can hang all the children off that. A full line if they're legitimate, and a dotted line if Fred and Mary did not in fact get married. So then, of course, what's likely in history and today is there might be a second marriage. So you put that beside the person who married, say Mary Jones married a second time, you put number 2 in brackets, you know, Tom Brown. And make sure that if there were children of that marriage, that they descend from that equals sign. Mentioned abbreviations before, some more which are quite handy to know are DSP, which means the Latin decessit sine proles, but it means died without children. And that's quite handy because you know you don't have to search that line. LIC means license. Most people today and in the past marrying in the Church of England, which is the one that kept the records, the Quakers kept brilliant records actually, got married by banns. So the vicar announces on 3 successive weeks that these two are planning to marry, which gives the society, the community, a chance to register an objection. So a marriage license enables you to get around that. And there were 2 categories of people who did that. One, people who had some money and were prepared to spend it on a license, and just because they didn't want busybodies from the local parish interfering with their affairs. But the other were those who were in a hurry. Either, you know, one's going off to sea, or the bride is very pregnant and they can't wait 3 weeks. You see that quite a lot. So your trees will print out, your software will print out trees in all sorts of ways, but those are the principles of how you can do it for yourself. Alana, can we have the next slide? This is a family tree, an example from that's got my great something grandfather and grandmother in the middle, Elizabeth Mayart marrying Daniel Wybrants in, I think, 1662. But this is also an example not only of a family tree, but also hand-drawn, also of the fact that never despair if you think you're from a category where there are no resources, because this is an Irish family tree. And yes, there was a terrible fire in 1922, the Four Courts fire, and a tragic amount of Ireland's records of all kinds were lost. That's why Ireland doesn't have records going back to the 1300s or 900s the same way that England does. But not everything was in the Four Courts building that day. And so there is a lot that escaped the fire and is out there and has been brought together online. This tree I found on Find My Past, and this is drawn in the 1800s by a very distinguished Irish genealogist who lived in the archives and did a lot of this with the records which have since been destroyed. So this is a treasure. And I was very pleased to see it, as you can imagine. Alana, next screen, please. So I've talked about rules and principles, and I promised you some tips. So here are some tips. First of all, don't get hung up on spelling. You know, you hear people say, we are Browns with an E. Well, no, you're not. Not before 1870 or so, which is when spelling got more standardized. Before that, it's all over the place. Names of people, names of towns, etc. So I'm a member of the Guild of One Name Studies, and we are committed to finding every instance of the surname we study everywhere in the world and linking them all up back to the 15 or 1400s. Hey, and most of my friends and colleagues in that have got 20 to 40 variations, that's 40 variations of the spelling of the surname that they're searching. So don't get too worried if your ancestor changes the spelling of their name. I've already said enough to indicate that there's a lot of errors out there. Sometimes they're deliberate. The heralds of visitations are wonderful things from the 1600s if you've got very posh ancestors, because they went out from the College of Arms trying to establish who had the right to bear arms, and some people lied to them, as some do on the internet, but most errors are inadvertent. Two numbers being transposed or lines missed when they're being transcribed. So just be alert to that. Also be alert to place names. There's dozens of Milfords in the UK because, of course, there are thousands of Mills and thousands of Fords. You might come across children who were baptized twice. I've found that. One ancestor, Havelock Huntrods, was baptized in 1800 and then again in 1804. What was going on? Answer: his little elder brother sadly had died in between. People do keep giving the same names to children who've died. In some cases, rather sadly, a lot. Maps can be wonderfully useful. So say in the census, your ancestor says she's from one little dot in 1851 and a different little place in 1861 and a town in 1861. She might in fact have lived in the same place the whole time, a farmhouse between the three. And the first time she just wrote down or told the enumerator the local hamlet, the second time the town nearby, and the third time the big town that other people would recognize. And if you look on a map, you see, oh, they're all really together. So it explains it. Dates can trip you up. In the 1750s, we dropped 11 days out of our life, and it's a bit complicated. And so I will leave it to Herber to explain to you. So in fact, read the first few chapters of Herba, I suggest, before you start. And for every new data set that you come across, you know, if you discover that your ancestor was in the army or went to India or was a nonconformist or a radical, then there'll be a chapter in Herba and it will get you off to the right start. Alana. So more tips. Wills. If don't necessarily think that you just have to go zooming back just somebody's father's father's father, because relatives, particularly maiden aunts, can sometimes leave you wonderful bits of information in their will. I've come across so many grumpy old ladies in the 19th century, excuse me. See, they took their revenge. They made something stick in my throat. Forgive me. I've come across many delightful old ladies in the 19th century who changed their will constantly, were forever leaving codicils, and you can see what's going on. Ex-nephew has annoyed them, and Y-niece suddenly is left the teaspoons, literally. Wills can tell you a lot. Newspapers and books have also been digitized. This is something else I haven't talked about. Booksgoogle.co.uk is another of my favorite haunts, but newspapers back to the 1760s have been digitized in a number of different projects. There are, I think, 40 million plus pages of digitized newspapers now online. This is on Find My Past, and this is where you really don't know what you're going to find. It might be, and this picks up all walks of society. Our ancestors might have been hauled up before the court. They might have been in a shipwreck. They might have been trading goods, and you know, they're registered as arriving in the port. I had one chap who was in one of the very early train crashes, and so I was able to read the report of what happened in the crash, and the very, very early train carriages were made entirely of wood, and it totally splintered and he was obviously deeply traumatized, and several weeks later when he was called before the coroner's court to give evidence, he was so, I mean, he had post-traumatic stress, obviously. He was still so shaken he couldn't give any evidence. Who knew? And there was my ancestor who played cricket, and I know he wasn't very good because the local newspapers would report all the sports results every week. And so I know that the most he ever scored for his team was 11. And many times he went out for a duck. So let's hope he was a decent bowler. So distant cousins can be a great value. So if you go up your family tree and sideways and down again, you can find people that you didn't know existed. Some of them will be doing their family history, so they'll have resources for you. And of course, logically, if you have families of, you know, multiple children, then some children inherit something and others inherit others. So somebody gets some photographs, somebody gets the family documents, somebody gets a picture, whatever. And if you go up and along and down, then you can plug into different bits of information you didn't know you could get. Distant cousins, great. This is just a small point. Paleography, you saw, is the study of old writing. You saw the old writing in the 1592 will, and that's a specialist subject. But one piece of that old writing that came forward right into the 1800s is the long S. So using what we would now think of as an F, where it's got a bit above and below the line, instead of S. So sometimes it can be really confusing. There's this stray thing that looks like an F, but if you think, could that be an S, that might help. Alana, next screen. Please. I promised I'd talk about DNA. I'm not going to say very much because I know nothing about it. But I do know enough to say the book for you to get is Graham Holton, Tracing Your Ancestors Using DNA. Very good book, kind of the Herba of DNA family history, and that's saying a lot. So this book starts at the absolute beginning and explains it crystal clearly and simply, including all of the ethical issues, including dealing with the very difficult subject of adoption. What about people who were adopted and they don't know who their birth parents were, and they're dying to find out? That raises many issues, and it's sensitively and beautifully and thoroughly handled by Graham Holton. And then, as the book goes on, he whizzes off into the highest stratospheres of the very, very, very sophisticated DNA stuff. He lost me about 2/3 of the way through, but I did persevere to the end. Anyway, so warmly recommend that book. But the other book that I really strongly recommend is Dani Shapiro's Inheritance, because this is an example of how dangerous and how distressing finding some results can be through DNA. So Dani Shapiro is a writer. She lives in New York. This book was published quite recently, last year, I think. And she is in her 40s and has a family and has had a very happy childhood, and Jewish, and really identifies with that and has wonderful memories, and was given a DNA test for her birthday and sent it off and discovered, shock, that she only shared 50% of the DNA with her sister. It very quickly became apparent that the shared was the mother, and her father, who she had loved and grown up with and had all these photographs and these memories and these hugs, was not her birth father, and she had never known, and her mother did know and hadn't told her. So you can imagine, she writes very movingly about how she freaked and sort of fell apart a bit, and the relationship with her mother, of course, came under considerable stress, and indeed with her sister. And then she and her husband turned themselves into family historian sleuths and went to try and find the birth father. And the story ends sort of happily, but boy, it's a salutary warning. So if you're going into DNA, great, amazing things you can find, and it is the only way to solve many problems. But just beware, and be particularly, beware for yourself, but be particularly careful if you're going to be possibly shattering somebody else's world. Next slide, please, Alana. So when lockdown ends, and history tells us that it will, when we're allowed to go out again, where are my favourite places? Well, obviously, you've already picked up, I am deeply in love with Kew, the National Archives. I'm also deeply in love with the British Library, and of course, like many archives and the British Library, all of the stuff there that you can access online is free. County record offices, wherever your ancestors came from, there will be a county record office, and it has marvellous people who understand the ins and outs of their particular local archives. And of course, if you go into an archive, particularly a county archive, this is where our coaching skill comes in really handy. We know about asking very productive questions. So you can interrogate somebody on the desk at a county archive, so if you were me, what question would you ask? Or what haven't I asked that I should ask, etc. I mean, they can raise their eyebrow, but it does trigger lots of valuable leads for you. I've already mentioned the Society of Genealogists. You can go there and pay a very tiny fee for visiting for one day, or you might like to join it. It's all, again, very cheap, and then you can access their stuff online. And I have loved going off and travelling around, going to places that my ancestors lived, Swire and Netherbury and Dorset. I'd never have been there in a million years if it hadn't been for this joyful hobby.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Anne. That was fascinating. We'll be stopping the recording of this webinar now before we move on to Q&A. The final recording of this webinar will be sent to attendees after the webinar, and will also be available on Connected. Thank you.